Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are going to take a look at the Papua New Guinea Volunteer Carbine. This is a very scarce today version of a Mauser carbine, and these originated in the Netherlands. So Papua New Guinea had been a Dutch colony in the Dutch East Indies, and in the early 1960s there was a major independence movement in Papua New Guinea, and the Dutch decided to pull out their colonial forces, and they promised independence to Papua. The problem was Indonesia, right next door, was also very interested in acquiring this territory, and so they started subtle military operations to try and basically take over control of Papua New Guinea. Now, the Dutch response to this was to send in the Dutch Marines and also to form a volunteer corps on the island of native islanders to help provide for their own self-defense. And the Dutch had to decide, well, the Dutch armed them and equipped them and had to decide what armament to provide. At this time, the Dutch military was evaluating the FAL and the AR-10. So the AR-10 was in production at Artillery in Richtingen, and they were considering adopting that, but they weren't entirely sure, and they kind of figured that they wanted to give the Papuans a simpler rifle, a bolt-action rifle, instead of a semi-auto rifle, possibly because they thought it would be easier for untrained, non-professional soldiers to operate, and probably also because it would be an easier gun to maintain. There's less to go wrong, and if you don't give a gun good routine maintenance, well, something like a Mauser carbine is going to last a lot longer than a semi-auto, like a FAL or an AR-10. And at this same time, there were some changes going on in the Dutch police forces. So the Dutch police had bought 6,000 of these nice, cute little Mauser carbines. They bought the first 5,000 in 1947 or 48. They bought another 1,000 in the early 1950s. And in the early 60s, they were starting to acquire M1 carbines instead. So there was a surplus of these short Mauser police carbines. And someone came up with this brilliant idea to take the police carbines and give them to Papua New Guinea. Now, they didn't want to do that quite in their stock form. They figured there were a few changes that needed to be made to the guns. For example, they needed a bayonet. They made some changes to the buttplate, the sights, the action. We'll take a look at all those in a moment because we have an original Dutch police carbine here, and then we have the Papua New Guinea version here, so we can see all the specific changes that were made. And perhaps most importantly, this was a very compact rifle for very compact soldiers who needed something that was a little bit lighter and shorter. This probably would have been rather unpleasant to shoot, but at least it was easy to carry. So, why don't we go ahead and take a close look at those changes. These rifles were all originally manufactured at FN. That's where the Netherlands government bought them originally. And then there were two separate contracts. And depending on who was regent at the time, they will have a different marking on the receiver. The first ones were purchased during the rule of Queen Wilhelmina, so they have a crown W. And then the second batch was purchased under the rule of Queen Juliana, so they have a big J. Now, the most obvious, well, there's several kind of obvious changes to these carbines. The first one is that the guns were parkerized. That was going to give them a better resistance to the jungle elements in Papua New Guinea. So if we compare here, this is an original intact police carbine, and this is one of the rebuilt guns. And you can see that the bolt has been parkerized where it was originally in the white, and instead of being blued, the receiver is now also parkerized. In fact, everything was parkerized right down to the sight blade. They did make one minor change to the sight, and I'm not entirely sure I understand why. But there was a cut made in the front of the sight. I think this has to do with being able to lower the sight slightly to recalibrate it for 7.62 NATO, because that is the third significant change that they made to these rifles. The police carbines were originally chambered for 8mm Mauser, and it was decided to make the Papua New Guinea carbines 7.62 NATO. While they hadn't entirely decided what rifle the Dutch military was going to be using. It might be the FAL, it might be the AR-10. They knew it would be in 7.62 NATO, so they could have nice, easy logistics by making these carbines in the same caliber. And if we look inside the receivers, you'll see that there is a spacer block here in the New Guinea carbine that is not in the 8mm one, and that's just to shorten up the magazine to properly fit 7.62 NATO, which is of course several millimeters shorter than 8mm. The original police carbines had just flat plain metal butt plates, and they decided, in deference to the fact that the Papua New Guinea volunteers were quite short of stature and that this was a quite heavy recoiling rifle, to put a rubber butt plate on all of the guns. So that was done. That's one of the more obvious external changes to the rifle. So they did also fit them with a compact bayonet. They changed up the style of the bayonet lug. So this is the police carbine with its Mauser pattern lug and a cleaning rod. The Papua New Guinea guns, they got rid of the cleaning rods because they manufactured a new pattern of bayonet for them, which is basically a modified AR-10 bayonet. The AR-10s, and thus their bayonets, were already in production, so it was fairly simple to make a bayonet of that style to fit on an FN Mauser here. The bayonet lug has been shortened to fit, and the cleaning rod has been removed because it would interfere with this bayonet. Those bayonets have a very small little artillery Inrichtingen logo there on the back of the blade. And they were also outfitted with a nice modern scabbard and frog, very similar to the M1 pattern, Garand pattern of rifle scabbard. This is what was also being made for the AR-10. It's actually not really known how many of these guns actually made it to Papua New Guinea. In total, they converted 2,700 to this new pattern, made 2,700 bayonets for them. Some got to the island, but it seems to have been rather lost to history. Exactly how many got there or exactly what happened to them, it seems most likely they were ultimately captured by Indonesia, as Indonesia did end up taking over control of the island, or of the Dutch half of the island. So, the effort didn't work ultimately, but it was a good effort, and it produced this very interesting carbine, which there are only, I believe, 4 of these known to still exist today, at least in the Netherlands, in collections. So it's very cool to be able to take a look at this one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, got a chance to see some pretty obscure differences in a pretty obscure carbine from a different part of the world. If you did, please do consider checking out my Patreon page. It is folks there who make it possible for me to travel around and find these rifles and bring them to you. And if not, certainly I understand. Enjoy the video, share with your friends, and thanks for watching.